There are disturbing movies, and then there are illegal ones. These are movies that were so disturbing for their time that they were made illegal to even watch. No fluff, let's just get into this. Huge content warning, this video has very bad topics and things we talk about. If you want, subscribe for more videos like this. Follow my Instagram and join my Discord. We can hang out and stuff, and I post some pretty cool stuff on Instagram. But yeah, let's get into this. I haven't made a movies iceberg in forever, guys. Who's been around that long since my last one? Okay, layer 1, we're gonna start with Faces of Death. Faces of Death came out in 1978 and instantly built a reputation as one of the most disturbing movies ever made. It was directed by John Allen Schwartz, who credited himself under the pseudonym Conan Le Clerc, and marketed it as a documentary showing real death caught on camera. That marketing hook is what made it famous. People believed that they were watching genuine snuff footage, and word of mouth turned it into a legend. The actual film is a mix. Some parts are real, like stock footage of accidents, autopsies, and animal slaughter, but a large portion was staged using actors and prosthetics. For example, the famous monkey brain scene that gets cited constantly was just an effect built for the movie. The blending of authentic and fabricated material is what kept audiences arguing for decades about what they had actually seen. In the UK, Faces of Death ended up on the list of video nasties in the early 1980s, a group of tapes prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. It was seized, banned, and stayed that way for years before eventually becoming available again. In the US, it circulated mainly in underground video stores and dorm room dares, gaining cult status precisely because people thought that they were watching something illegal or forbidden. The movie didn't stop there. It spawned several sequels across the 1980s and 1990s. All built on the same premise of shocking audiences with a mix of staged gore and real footage. Critics condemned it as an exploitative and tasteless movie, but the series carved out a unique place in horror history. It probably went too far though, this is not a good movie. I Spit on Your Grave. I Spit on Your Grave is one of the most notorious exploitation films ever. It was written and directed by Mir Zarki in the 1970s, and originally released under the title Day of the Woman. The movie follows a young writer who moves to a secluded cabin to work on her book, only to be brutally assaulted by a group of men. She survives, and the rest of the film is about her tracking each of them down and killing them in very graphic ways. The split between the two halves, first an extended sequence of SA, then a violent revenge spree, made the movie one of the most divisive in film history. Some saw it as a feminist revenge story, where the victim reclaims her power and punishes her attackers, but many more condemned it as deeply exploitative, arguing that the shock value of the first half overshadowed everything else and it was tasteless. Because of that, it was heavily censored around the world. Ireland, Norway, Iceland, and West Germany outright banned it. In the UK, it became wrapped up in that whole video nasties panic, where VHS tapes were again seized and prosecuted for being too obscene. The film couldn't legally circulate for years, and even when it did eventually get approved, it only happened after major cuts. In the US, it was never banned, but it was just as hated by critics. Roger Ebert famously called it a vile bag of garbage, and most mainstream reviewers dismissed it as one of the lowest points of the exploitation era. At the same time, it gained a cult following precisely because of that reputation. Viewers who sought out the most extreme banned films made it part of the grindhouse and underground video circuit. Even decades later, I Spit on Your Grave is still debated. It's been remade, it's had sequels, but the original continues to be one of the most infamous titles associated with censorship and controversy. It's less remembered as a movie people like than as a film that people want to argue about, and it stayed in that little vein ever since. Exorcist-style bands from the 1970s and 80s. When people think about movie censorship, they usually picture obscure grindhouse titles or gore films that barely made it out of the basement. But what's wild about the 1970s and 80s is that even mainstream horror classics got swept up in the same censorship wave. That's why this iceberg has a whole category I'm calling Exorcist-style bands. The main example is The Exorcist from 1973. In the US, it was a phenomenon. Oscar nominations, box office records, people lining up outside theaters. In the UK, it was technically released without issue in cinemas, but when home video became a thing in the early 80s, the climate changed. This movie was never officially actually put on that banned video nasties list, but Warner Brothers pulled it from shelves voluntarily in 1981. Why? Because the Obscene Publications Act made it risky to have controversial tape circulating uncut, and nobody wanted to get dragged into court. For the next 18 years, The Exorcist was essentially unavailable on video in the UK. The only way you could see it was if you caught a rare cinema screening, and even those were extremely limited. It wasn't until 1999 that it finally came back to home release in Britain, uncut, and people treated it like a cultural event. Then you have The Evil Dead from 1981. Sam Raimi's low-budget horror blew up with fans because of how over-the-top it was, but in Britain, it hit like a brick wall. Unlike The Exorcist, The Evil Dead actually did get caught up in the video nasties prosecutions. Distributors were dragged to court, the movie was edited down, re-released, cut again, and basically turned into a political football. It became one of the poster children for the panic, with prosecutors waving VHS sleeves in court as proof of society's moral decline, which is insane. The uncut version didn't properly settle into UK circulation until much later. Other big-name horror films got tangled too. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from '74 wasn't technically prosecuted under the Nasties law, but for decades it was denied a video certificate by the BBFC, which meant that it legally couldn't be sold in the UK at all. People ended up trading bootleg copies like it was contraband, and even movies like Stray Dogs from 1971 and The Last House on the Left from 1972 bounced in and out of classification limbo, with some regions allowing them and others banning them outright. The irony of all this is that these films are now seen as genre-defining classics. The Exorcist, in particular, has topped the greatest horror movie of all time tier lists for decades. But for almost 20 years, if you lived in Britain, it was treated like forbidden media. The kind of thing parents whispered about but couldn't actually rent. And that's what makes this Exorcist-style wave so strange. It wasn't just about the, underground gore tapes getting hammered, it was about the movies that shaped mainstream horror itself. It just goes to show, I guess, how far our culture has come. In a good way, you know? It's the same thing about, how people used to say that rock music was the music of the devil, and that, drums made you evil. And now they're saying the same thing about rap music, and I'm sure whatever happens next, they'll say the same thing about, but it's a good thing that we're moving on, you know? And with that, we are done with Layer 1, guys. Let's get into Layer 2, starting with Cannibal Holocaust from 1980. If there's one movie that embodies the phrase disturbing and illegal, it's Cannibal Holocaust. Released in 1980 and directed by Ruggero Deodato, it's often cited as one of the most controversial films ever made, and not without reason. The story is about a documentary crew that goes missing in the Amazon, and when their footage is found, it shows in graphic detail how they staged atrocities, provoked indigenous tribes, and ultimately met a violent end. Structurally, it's basically the prototype to the found footage style long before Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity. The controversy came instantly. The movie shows extreme violence, SA, and most infamously, several scenes of animals being unalived on camera. Those killings were not staged, they're real. A coati, a turtle, a monkey, a pig, all slaughtered on screen for shock value. Even people who defend this film as art usually agree that those scenes are indefensible, and they've been the reason that Cannibal Holocaust has been banned or heavily cut in many countries ever since. But what really pushed this film into legend was what happened to the director Deodato after its release. Italian authorities were so convinced that the killings of the human characters were real that they charged him with murder, essentially accusing him of making a snuff film. The actors were contractually required to stay out of public eye for a year to fuel the marketing myth that they'd actually died. So when the trial began, their lack of proof for their survival made the accusations look convincing. It wasn't until Deodato's legal team brought the cast into court alive and well that the charges were dropped. Even then, he still faced convictions related to the animal cruelty scenes. Internationally, the film was treated as toxic. It was outright banned in places like the UK, Australia, and several Scandinavian countries, often reappearing years later only in heavily censored editions. Even in the US, it floated around as a kind of forbidden VHS traded by collectors who wanted to test their limits. Critics mostly hated it, many called it pure exploitation dressed up as social commentary, but it developed a cult following precisely because of that reputation. Today, Cannibal Holocaust is remembered less as a movie that people actually enjoy, and more as a benchmark of extremity. It's the film that crossed so many lines at once, fiction mixed with real killings, fake snuff marketed as reality, and a director who literally had to prove in court that he wasn't a murderer, that it still sits at the center of conversations about the limits of horror. Guinea Pig 2: Flower of Flesh and Blood from 1985. The Guinea Pig films are a Japanese underground series that were designed to push boundaries as far as possible, and Flower of Flesh and Blood is the one that became infamous worldwide. Released in 1985, it's only about 40 minutes long, and the entire film, holy fuck, is essentially just one extended torture sequence. A woman is kidnapped by a man dressed like a samurai and then slowly dismembered piece by piece. There's almost no story, no dialogue, just a showcase of brutal special effects. What made it legendary was how real the effects looked. Their gore work was so convincing that in 1991, Charlie Sheen reportedly got hold of a copy and genuinely believed he had been sent a snuff film. Disturbed, he contacted the FBI and an investigation was actually opened. It wasn't until behind-the-scenes footage surfaced, showing the special effects team building prosthetics and faking the kills, that the case was closed and the film was confirmed to be staged. In Japan, the Guinea Pig film circulated mainly in the underground, but in the West, they built a reputation as forbidden tapes that horror collectors dared each other to track down. The Sheen/FBI incident only fueled that legend. To this day, Flower of Flesh and Blood is talked about less as a movie with any narrative value and more as one of the most infamous cases of horror effects being mistaken for reality. It's crazy. Men Behind the Sun from 1988. Men Behind the Sun is a Chinese film directed by T.F. Mao that came out in 1988, and it's one of the most disturbing war movies ever made. Instead of being horror fiction, it's a dramatization of the real Unit 731 atrocities committed by the Japanese army during World War II. Unit 731 was a covert biological warfare program where human experimentation was carried out on prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians and captured soldiers, in horrific ways. The movie doesn't shy away from showing that brutality in graphic detail. Scenes include vivisections, exposure experiments, and biological weapons testing, all portrayed with a level of realism that completely shocked audiences. Adding to the controversy, the production used extreme methods for certain shots. The most infamous example, this is fucking fucked up, dude, oh my god, I'm thinking about my cat right now, and I'm disturbed. The most infamous example is a scene showing a cat being thrown into a room full of rats and eaten alive, which was not staged. The cruelty was real. That, combined with the subject matter, obviously, thank God, led to bans and heavy cuts in multiple countries. The film has a strange place in cinema history. On one hand, it's been defended as an unflinching attempt to confront historical atrocities that many outside China weren't even aware of at the time. On the other, the use of real animal cruelty and the extreme imagery meant that for many people, it crossed into pure exploitation. In the UK and Australia, censored versions eventually made it through classification, but the movie's reputation remains tied to that question of whether showing this level of realism is educational, exploitative, or both. Necromantic from 1987. If Cannibal Holocaust is remembered for blurring the line between fiction and reality, Necromantic is remembered for taking one of the most extreme taboos imaginable and building an entire movie around it. Directed by German filmmaker Jörg Buttgereit in 1987, this was not a horror movie in the usual sense. It was more of an experimental art house film, but with a subject matter so shocking that it immediately got banned almost everywhere. The story follows a man named Rob who works for a street cleaning crew tasked with collecting bodies after accidents. Instead of being horrified by his work, he steals body parts and eventually brings an entire corpse home to share with his girlfriend. The film then shows the two of them engaging in sexual activity with the body. When Rob loses both his girlfriend and the corpse, the story spirals into a surreal and disturbing exploration of his loneliness, obsession, and necrophilia. Because of that, Necromantic was instantly controversial, obviously. In Germany, the police raided video shops to seize copies. It was outright banned in several countries, including Iceland and Norway, and for decades, it was one of those titles passed around only in bootleg form. Even in places where it technically wasn't illegal, most distributors just wouldn't touch it. The movie did, however, develop a following in underground horror circles. Some saw it as pure shock for shock's sake, but others argued that this director was using necrophilia as a metaphor for alienation and decay in post-war Germany. Either way, its reputation as one of the most extreme art house films only grew over time. It wasn't until 2014 that the British Board of Film Classification finally passed Necromantic uncut with an 18 rating, allowing it to be released legally in the UK for the first time. By then, it had already become a cult classic for fans of transgressive cinema, remembered less for any cinematic polish and more for the fact that it dared to put something on screen that almost no other filmmaker would touch. And it's up to you, I guess, if you think that it's a good movie or not. And that's the end of Layer 2, guys. Let's get into Layer 3. Make sure you got some water and it's not too dark in your room because it's gonna get scary. Bismois from 2000. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry to my French fans. Bismois came out in 2000 and immediately ran headfirst into controversy. It's often described as a R-word revenge road movie, but it doesn't play like the grindhouse films of the 70s. Instead, it follows two women, one a sex worker and the other recently assaulted, who snap, steal a gun, and go on a violent spree across France. The film's defining element was its refusal to separate sex and violence. The sex scenes are unsimulated, shot with real adult performers and shown explicitly, while the violence is presented with the same blunt realism. That combination pushed it into uncharted territory because censors had no easy category for it. Was it porn? Was it art house? Was it exploitation? It ended up being labeled as all three, depending on who you asked. In France, it was slapped with an X rating usually reserved for pornography, which effectively kept it out of most theaters. In Australia, it actually managed a short theatrical run with an R rating before a backlash forced it to be pulled and banned. Other countries either cut it heavily or refused to classify it at all. Critics were just as divided. Some called it an angry feminist statement, others said it was nothing more than a provocation dressed up as politics. What's striking about Bismois is how it sits in between worlds. It wasn't underground enough to be ignored, but it also wasn't polished or restrained enough to slip into the art house circuit without a fight. It ended up living in that uncomfortable space where it was too raw for mainstream audiences, too explicit for feminist critics to all rally behind, but too bold to disappear completely. And that's why people still bring it up. Not because it's widely loved, but because of the very specific firestorm it created at the moment it was released. A Serbian film. This one doesn't really need an introduction. A Serbian film has gone down as probably the most infamous movie of the 2010s. It came out in 2010, and the plot is about a retired adult film actor who gets talked into doing one last mysterious job. Of course, that job turns out to be way darker than he was led to believe, and the deeper he goes, the more horrific and exploitative it gets. The reason people still talk about this movie is because of what it shows. There are scenes of violence, and one in particular that crosses into I don't know if I should, I don't even want to talk about that. I mean, if you probably know this movie already, and you can guess because, like, God, bro, like, you can guess. I'm not gonna say it. But it is staged. It's not real, obviously. The actors, it was staged. It was not actually explicit to those certain actors, but it's still disturbing to think about. And that's the line that immediately set it apart from other shocking movies. You can't unsee that aspect of it, and censors around the world pretty much agreed it had gone too far. Spain, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK all either banned it completely or only allowed heavily edited versions. In the UK, the BBFC made nearly 50 cuts before it could be legally released. The director has always insisted that it was meant as political commentary, basically saying the Serbian people have been exploited and destroyed by their own government in the same way the protagonist is used and discarded in the film. And while that's an interesting lens to look at it through, a lot of critics felt the message got lost under the sheer extremity of what's happening on screen. And what's unique about a Serbian film is that it's not like some grainy underground VHS. It was shot professionally, it looks polished, and it feels like it could have been a festival film if not for the content. Instead, it instantly turned radioactive. Festivals canceled screenings, distributors dropped it, and it became one of those titles people bring up as a kind of final boss of disturbing movies. Not because anyone actually enjoys watching it, but because it represents the outer edge of what filmmakers have ever tried to put in front of an audience. Grotesque from 2009. By the late 2000s, torture porn had already peaked in the mainstream with movies like Saw and Hostel. But Japan's Grotesque went far beyond what those films ever tried. The premise is brutally simple. A young couple is kidnapped by a sadistic man, tied up, and then systemically tortured for the rest of the movie. There's no backstory, no social commentary, no elaborate traps, it's just cruelty for cruelty's sake. When the British Board of Film Classification reviewed it, they refused to give it a certificate at all, which is again effectively a ban in the UK. Their explanation was pretty blunt. The film had little purpose other than the depiction of sadistic torture, which meant it wasn't going to get passed no matter how many cuts the distributor might have offered. That decision drew headlines at the time, because even after decades of banning and unbanning extreme films, Grotesque was seen as a throwback to those outright, refusals of the video nasties days. Outside the UK, the movie circulated mainly in underground horror communities, often passed around with the label of being too shocking to screen. Among fans of extreme cinema, it became a sort of badge movie, the kind of thing you track down just to see if you could sit through it. But in terms of wider distribution, it stayed locked out of most markets. What's interesting is that Grotesque didn't really break new ground in terms of effects or storytelling. By 2009, audiences had already seen realistic gore. What made it stand out was how stripped down it was. There was just no attempt at a plot at all. The Bunny Game. The Bunny Game is one of those films that pretty much exists on the extreme fringe of cinema. Released in 2011 and directed by Adam Raymeyer, it tells the story of a drug-addicted sex worker who is picked up by a truck driver and then subjected to days of abuse and degradation. The whole thing was shot in stark black and white on a shoestring budget, and it leans heavily into a style that feels more like an endurance test than a traditional narrative film. What immediately sets it apart from other extreme horror titles was how unflinching it was about the sexual violence. The performances were improvised to a large degree, and the lead actress has actually said in interviews that what she went through during filming was meant to reflect her own experiences with trauma. That intent gives the movie a raw, almost documentary-like edge, but it also made it incredibly difficult for classification boards to deal with. In the UK, the BBFC flatly refused to classify the film. Their official reasoning was that the work was, quote, concerned with the abusive treatment and sexual violence of a woman for an extended period of time, unquote, with no context or counterbalance to justify it. In other words, it wasn't framed as critique or satire or even as revenge, it was just relentless degradation. And that crossed the line for them. And again, without classification, the movie could not be legally distributed in Britain at all. Elsewhere, it slipped through on the underground festival circuit, where it was often marketed as one of the most disturbing films ever made. Some critics viewed it as a piece of art therapy for the actress, a raw channeling of trauma into performance. Others dismissed it as exploitation dressed up in art house style, pointing out that the lack of narrative structure left it feeling more like a prolonged depiction of suffering than a story. Either way, The Bunny Game carved out its place by being one of the rare films in the 2010s to get a hard ban from a major board. By then, most censorship groups had loosened up compared to like the 1980s, so their refusal stood out all the more. The movie never entered the mainstream, but its reputation spread quickly in horror forums and extreme cinema communities as the kind of title you sought out only if you were specifically looking for the limits of what a film could show. Hate Crime. Hate Crime is a 2013 found footage horror film directed by James Colin Bressac, and it ended up making history in Britain for all the wrong reasons. The setup is deceptively simple. A Jewish family is celebrating a child's birthday when their home is invaded by a group of masked neo-Nazis. The entire movie plays out as a handheld video of what happens next. Hours of humiliation, torture, and violence at the hands of the intruders. The problem for censors wasn't just the violence itself, but how it was presented. The attackers scream racial slurs, force family members to assault each other, and the film barely cuts away from any of it. It isn't stylized, it isn't exaggerated, it's raw and claustrophobic, designed to look like unfiltered footage of a hate crime unfolding in real time. When the BBFC reviewed it, they refused classification entirely, and their report said that the film consisted of unremitting racist and sexual violence with no meaningful context. It's just another movie where there wasn't a revenge arc or any kind of critique of politics or anything. It was just 90 minutes of a family being terrorized. And the reaction outside the UK wasn't much warmer. Some defenders argue that it was intended as a commentary on racism and fascism, using the rawness of found footage to make the audience confront real-world brutality. But a much louder majority felt the opposite, that it crossed the line into exploitation by dragging viewers through relentless suffering without offering anything beyond shock. In the US and online horror communities, hate crime developed a reputation as one of those do not watch unless you're prepared movies. It didn't get mainstream distribution, and unlike some other banned movies that later got reassessed, hate crime has pretty much stayed on the margins, known more as a case study in censorship than as a film that people want to revisit. And that was Layer 3, let's get into Layer 4. Titty Cut Follies. Titty Cut Follies is a documentary directed by Frederick Wiseman in 1967, and it's the only American film to ever be banned by a court order for reasons other than obscenity or national security. Wiseman was given permission to film inside the Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Massachusetts, and what he captured was shocking. Not because of gore or special effects, but because of how dehumanizing the institution was. The movie shows inmates being stripped, force-fed, mocked by guards, and left in bare cells without dignity or care. There are no interviews, no narration, just raw observational footage. It was the first time that most Americans had ever seen the inside of a place like this, and it painted a damning picture of how vulnerable people were being treated in state custody. When it premiered, the Massachusetts government panicked. Officials claimed the film violated the privacy of the inmates since many of them couldn't legally consent to being filmed. Families of patients also filed complaints arguing that the documentary exposed their loved ones in humiliating ways. A judge agreed, and in 1967, a Massachusetts Superior Court judge ordered the film suppressed. For decades, the only people allowed to see it were doctors, lawyers, and educators who could request special screenings. That court order stayed in place for almost 25 years. It wasn't until 1991 that the ban was finally lifted, and the film could be released to the public. By then, Titty Cut Follies had taken on an almost mythical reputation. It was the forbidden documentary, the film people whispered about but couldn't actually watch. When it finally resurfaced, it became clear why the state had tried to bury it. The conditions at Bridgewater were indefensible, and the film stood as evidence of systemic abuse. The Guinea Pig series. The Guinea Pig films were a set of Japanese direct-to-video movies produced throughout the 1980s and early 90s. They were never meant for mainstream release. They were V-cinema titles sold in specialty shops, marketed specifically to hardcore horror collectors. The whole concept was to test the limits of gore effects, and each entry took a slightly different approach to that idea. The series kicked off in 1985 with Guinea Pig Devil's Experiment, which is basically a 45-minute endurance test where a woman is subjected to increasingly brutal torture methods. There's no plot, it's just staged violence designed to look authentic enough to disturb even the most jaded viewer. That "is it real" angle was the hook, and it carried into Flower of Flesh and Blood, which we talked about earlier, which is the second entry. But the series didn't stop there. Guinea Pig 3, He Never Dies, from '86, is often considered the comedy entry. I'm saying comedy in quotations, by the way. It follows a depressed man who discovers he can't feel pain, and so he starts mutilating himself for laughs. It's still graphic, but it has a different, almost satirical tone. Guinea Pig 4, Mermaid in a Manhole, from 1988, shifts into body horror. An artist finds a dying mermaid in a sewer and paints her as she decomposes, which leads to some of the series' most grotesque special effects. Then there's Guinea Pig 5, Android of Notre Dame, from 1988, where a scientist experiments on corpses in hopes of curing his sister's illness. Less realistic gore, more surreal mad scientist imagery. And finally Guinea Pig 6 from 1990, which is called Devil Woman Doctor, which played more like an anthology horror comedy parodying medical shock films. Even with those tonal shifts, the reputation stuck to the entire series. Internationally, the guinea pig tapes were treated like contraband. In the US, customs officials sometimes seized them under obscenity laws, and in Britain they floated around as bootlegs because no distributor wanted to risk prosecution. The FBI investigation after Flower of Flesh and Blood only amplified the myth that these were illegal snuff films from Japan. What made them notorious wasn't just the content, but also how they were consumed. They weren't shown in theaters, they weren't reviewed by mainstream critics. They spread hand to hand in video trading circles or through horror fanzines. The series eventually got banned or heavily restricted in several countries. In Japan, they were tolerated as underground curiosities, but internationally they were seen as borderline criminal. Even now, they're remembered less as movies in the traditional sense, and more as just like a test of how far special effects could go, before it was called illegal. Non-films, actual criminal evidence. When people trade stories about the most disturbing movies ever made, sometimes the conversation drifts into things that aren't movies at all. In underground circles, you'll occasionally see actual criminal footage or evidence recordings mislabeled as if they're part of the same category as banned films. The difference is huge. Exploitation or horror films might get banned, censored, or refuse classification, but they're still works of fiction. Real criminal footage, on the other hand, is exactly that, evidence of actual crimes. Examples of what gets lumped into this category include genuine crime scene tapes, war atrocity footage smuggled out of conflict zones, or recordings of abuse. These aren't written, staged, or performed like movies. They're illegal to possess in almost every jurisdiction because they're not entertainment, they're direct documentation of violence or exploitation. In fact, when this kind of material circulates, mislabeled as a disturbing movie, law enforcement gets involved. Police have seized tapes and DVDs that were being traded as if they were horror movies, only to find out they were recordings connected to real crimes. And that's why this category sits at the bottom of the iceberg. Movies like Cannibal Holocaust or Guinea Pig flirted with the illusion of being real, and that illusion was enough to get their creators investigated. But this material doesn't pretend, it is real. The moment you cross into that territory, you're not talking about cinema anymore, you're talking about actual criminal evidence. That's also why this kind of content almost never sees the light of day legally. When it surfaces, authorities move to shut it down and prosecute those responsible for distributing it. And that was the disturbing illegal movies iceberg, guys. Thank you for watching. This one was very rough. I don't know if I want to do more like this, honestly. I mean, I know it's all, fictional and stuff, but still, it's like weird to talk about. But I hope you enjoyed, guys. I subscribe for more content type shit. You know how it is. Let me know what you want to see in the comments below, and I hope you all have a great night. Sweet dreams.